Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hey, it's Zoe, your friendly neighborhood leadership expert, Canadian-Australian leadership expert. And my question for you today is, do you think you're good at building trust? Probably you think, yeah, I am. I'm a good human. I'm trustworthy and I trust people. So yeah, I'm good at it. Well, chances are if you think you're good at building trust, you aren't. And that's what my guest today has to say about trust. She is a leadership expert specializing in trust. She's written a book called Trusted to Thrive. Her name is Marie-Claire Ross. She started her career as a video recorder. She started business with her husband, and she was telling me before we got onto the recording that she used to do voiceovers, and they had this tiny little recording studio in their closet surrounded by pillows and dunas. And that was her start into a career of finding out what matters to people and what matters to businesses, was recording videos for them about safety. And she goes into a little bit of a story in the interview. What I want you to think about as we go through this episode is, how do you do trust? Is it something that you systematically work at? And if you don't, perhaps you should. So this is what Marie-Claire is going to share with us today. So without further ado, on with the show. Marie-Claire Ross, all the way from Melbourne. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Zoe. It's so wonderful to be here. Really excited about our chat today.
Because we're talking about trust and your beautiful new book, Trusted to Thrive. And it seems to be a hot topic lately, actually, in the research and in the zeitgeist about running effective teams and making sure that there's trust involved. And I think as soon as you start talking about hybrid teams, the trust question comes up. You know, like, how can we trust people to do their work and so on? Before we get into the nitty-gritty detail of your theory and practice around trust, how did you end up getting to this point where you're writing a book on trust? What's your backstory?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not a straightforward question. I've had a really weird career. So I started my career in market research, doing big studies for corporates and government around Australia, and then ended up running my own business with my husband. We started a video production company. And when I was doing that, I actually started working with companies to improve their training and safety induction by creating videos.
Oh, really?
And I got really into it. So because I realized this is, back in 2007 it started. And I realized that companies really had a lot of work to do to create really nice cultures and keep people physically safe. And so I was constantly learning how to create really good training. But the more work I did within companies, the more I realized that trust was an issue. And I ended up writing a book called Transform Your Safety Communication. And at the heart of my model was the word trust. And I just remember someone saying to me in England that, they really liked my model and it was really good. And I went, I've got a sneaking suspicion trust is going to be my life's work, because I need to do a lot more research into it. And basically I have spent, since 2014 studying it, whether it's research studies or doing my own research. So because I've got a background in research, I have to research the bejesus out of everything. So I do a lot of stakeholder interviews in companies and do research within companies. But when I started my business, I interviewed lots and lots of people. In fact, some of the people that I interviewed are even featured in the book, such as Kate Morris, the founder of Adore Beauty, because I just really wanted to know what leaders were doing and what employees wanted.
Wow. So some video production on safety stuff turning into an obsession with trust. In your research around trust, what was the most surprising thing that came up for you as you did all this research?
Well, what was interesting was I talked to so many different leaders, and I found that particularly CEOs of mid-sized companies that I was interviewing, they were intuitively building trust. And they were always thinking about the other person, and even they would actually worry at night, how do I build trust with this person? It was something that they were actively thinking about. But leaders that weren't that good, didn't have the performance metrics to back up their leadership, they really weren't thinking about trust. They were thinking it more from the perspective of, how do I get this person to trust me to do what I want, but not about looking at themselves and what they needed to do. And that was the real difference, that ability to self-reflect and be self-aware.
Sounds pretty basic, right? It's like, do I trust them or not? And rather than putting up the mirror and going, what am I doing to build trust? It's definitely a two-way street, as you're suggesting. So that was surprising to you, is the lack of self-awareness that leaders had?
Yeah, well, because the thing is, when you look at the research, we are actually biologically designed to look out at the world to make sure that we're safe. But we're actually not designed to look within ourselves and see what we're doing to cause the issues. And there's some research by Dr. Tash Ulrich, and she actually found in her research just a few years ago that it's really between 5 to 15% of leaders are actually self-aware. It's incredibly low.
What? How do you actually measure self-awareness?
Oh, she's actually, if you go to her website, she's actually got some tools where you can actually measure your self-awareness, and she breaks it down by internal and external.
What's her name again? So I just want to capture that.
Tash, Tash. It might be Tasha or Tash Ulrich, which is Eurich.
Tash Ulrich. Okay, we'll make sure that there's a link in the show notes for people as well.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. She's written a really good book. I think it's called Insight. I think. But what's really interesting is I do a lot of, research within companies, and I have my own assessments. And what I found a few years ago was that I would always do an assessment in a workshop just to see how people thought they were behaving when it came to trust. And what I found time and time again is that low trust leaders, and they were designated as being low trust according to their 360s, pretty much rated themselves 10 out of 10 for everything. 10 out of 10. And after my workshop, they would rate themselves maybe a 7, 8 if they were feeling really generous. And at the time I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I'm doing a terrible job. But of course, what I was doing was making them realize that they actually had some work to do. So it was kind of destabilizing them a little bit, but starting to get that self-awareness. And I see this all the time. As soon as someone tells me they're really good at building trust, I'm sorry, I just know that they're not. Because no one that's good at trust says they're good at trust. It's like no one that's really clever goes around telling everyone how smart they are. It's, self-evident.
I love that. It's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of a real estate agent that I was part of a networking group with. And he had a tagline, which was something, I'm the agent that you can trust. And I know, right? That's your reaction too. No, why do you have that reaction?
Well, you know what we do, because that's how our brain processes trust. So what's really interesting in the research is if you look at the brain, the limbic brain, the old brain that we've had since our days surviving the African savannah, actually processes our emotions such as trust and loyalty. And it does this all subconsciously. And so we trust people not based on what they say, but how they make us feel. And so a lot of leaders, and I'm going to be really out there, and I'm going to say a lot of male leaders think that it's just, you can trust me. But that's not how our brains work. So it does make us feel queasy in the tummy, because what we want to see evidence of is there's a match between what people say and their actions. And there's a bit of a time lag with that, obviously. And so you can't actually talk your way into trust. You have to behave your way into it. Yet we're in this society that thinks, oh, we can just talk about it, or we can even just talk to people about trust. But that's not it, because you've really got to really get into the emotional part of the brain, which actually looks for non-verbal communication rather than verbal, for proof that they can trust the other person.
So if you're behaving your way into trust, what kinds of behaving are you actually doing?
Well, you're sending signals that you value them and you appreciate them, and that it's safe for them to speak up. that they're connected, and that you actually have a future together. So you're considering their future. That's why, if people who are in short-term contracts, they usually don't bother about building trust because they know there's no future. But, building future is really important. And that's why COVID's so hard for us, because as human beings, we need certainty.
So how do you actually build a future with someone? Like, tell me a little bit of what you mean by that.
Yeah, so there's lots of different stages to this. And this is what I found really interesting in my research. So what I found because I did a lot of work with mid-size CEOs from mid-sized companies. So when I say mid-sized CEOs, it makes them sound quite big, but that's not what I mean. It's not their weight. So when it comes to the research, what I found was that a lot of CEOs, particularly from SMEs, they don't tell people the vision. It's in their head. And it seems really obvious, but what I found was that in the research with companies, if the CEO wasn't giving people the vision, people would start to freak out, and they didn't have that certainty. So they would work on the wrong tasks, they would, waste a lot of time, and there'd be a lot of fear and anxiety when I spoke to them. But when I did research in companies where the CEOs and even the leadership team did that really well, there was another thing that came into it, and that is people wanted to know their future in terms of their career plans. And so when people got this big vision, their thought was, how am I going to contribute to that? What are the career plans? And some people would even be freaking out and thinking, well, that's really good, but we're really busy now. What support are we going to have? What extra resources? What extra staffing? Because if this is going to continue, I don't think I'm going to be able to, cope. So it's when it comes to, really helping people understand the future, it's even tapping into letting people know that there's something exciting to look forward to and that the hard work is worth it.
I think that's really useful, like something to look forward to. And I think that's what a lot of people are struggling with. I used to look forward to overseas trips. Well, haven't been able to do that for a long time. Used to look forward to the company end of year party. Well, got canceled, COVID canceled. There's been a lot of things we were looked forward to that got taken off the table. And it's kind of trying to find something new to look forward to that doesn't remind us of what we used to get or used to be able to do.
Yeah, and it's so true. And it's not even just, it's not just in work. It's with our personal lives as well. We just need something to look forward to. And we just need leaders to help us understand that. But one of the interesting things is that I've found in my research in organisations, big and small, is that it's not enough to talk about the future. People are really smart. They actually want to know the thinking, the critical thinking behind those decisions. Because leaders are playing with people's lives in terms of their financial well-being. So people want to know that the decisions that are being made at the top are actually going to propel the organisation and not have the organisation at risk of failing and therefore their careers. So people really love that leaders share the thinking behind their decisions and even acknowledge when there are issues. So what I found fascinating was this company that I did research in had wonderful culture. People love their jobs. When I talked to them, they would just, light up with how much they loved the work that they were doing. But there were really big issues with resourcing. So they weren't spending the money on new staff and new software and all that sort of stuff. And so people were working really long hours and they were exhausted. And that wasn't being acknowledged. And when the employees would tell the senior leaders, they would just dismiss them. They'd get really excited by any future ideas or any wins or things like that. But if anyone brought up problems, they were really sidelined and ignored, which was quite surprising. And people were really hurt by it. And so, what I found was, and I find this a lot, that if you just go in and talk about, yay, we're doing this amazing vision, we're going to go over here and this is going to happen and we're going to blah, blah, blah. Particularly with CEOs who are very visionary and very charismatic and can really paint that beautiful picture, people really need to know the thinking behind it, even decisions that they decided against. And it actually makes the company stronger because then people can understand the decisions leaders are making and are more likely to make the right decision in their day-to-day tasks as well.
Oh, that totally makes sense to me. Like, everybody loves a bit of autonomy and nobody likes to have change imposed upon them. And if you're going to go along for the ride and get buy-in, explaining why of something makes complete sense to me. One of the things that you mentioned in your book and something you said triggered a thought around this for me, or a question for you actually, is you talk about being able to manage perceived fairness. And it's part of like building, I think it was building safety, or maybe it was part of creating connection, your system of trust in there. I love this question because it's one of the gritty issues I find is that people perceive fairness completely differently to one another. So what's your suggestion or approach to managing people and their perceptions of fairness?
Yeah, this one's a really hard one, and it's something that I'm constantly trying to work out myself. Because if you're a parent, you know, ensuring that your children feel like you're treating them fairly is always difficult. But what I've found, and the research points this out, is that it's really about talking about the context a lot. And I find that we often don't share the context, the why behind the decisions. And sometimes it just means really helping people understand if you've made a decision for someone that, you know, might irk someone. And it's being aware of that. And that's really hard because sometimes we're not aware that we might be doing something that could be perceived as unfair. But this is why leaders who regularly do one-on-ones with their direct reports and have those open conversations can really unearth any perceived unfairness that might be coming out because the person can talk about it. Because sometimes as human beings, we're not even able to articulate we feel that we're being treated unfairly. And so as a leader, we've got to really have that open relationship where it can come up in a way that people might not even realise is an issue. And of course, that's quite tricky. But the closer the relationships and the more we have those times where we can sit and chat about things, the more we can see the signs that people might feel that way.
I think that's a really important point that you make, is having those one-on-ones to be able to listen and hear what people perceive as fair and equitable is one thing. And then the other part of that is explaining, as you say, context and rationale behind particular decisions or structures or whatever. It still doesn't make it any easier to swallow if the decision is against what you as an individual believe and perceive. I'm thinking about some more salient recent examples where I have CEOs dealing with vaccination requirements in their workplace, and they've got staff who refuse to get vaccinated, and the perceived unfairness of having to comply with a mandate like that from their employer is not being bridged, you know, like the employee who doesn't want to get vaccinated is like, this is unfair. And the business believes that it is fair. So what do you do in that circumstance, do you think?
Yeah, well, when it comes to vaccination, that's actually a really hard one. But it's really about, you know, just having that open conversation. And also where I find a lot of leaders get it wrong is if someone does find something unfair, the leader just dismisses it and shuts down any conversation about it.
That certainly happened to me when I was an employee working at an organization and I wanted to address an issue of equity in terms of payment and salary issues. And my CEO backed me on that, but the board came back with a different decision. And I was like, oh my God, that's so unfair. And it wasn't handled well by either the board or the CEO in terms of, as you say, like being dismissive or downplaying it. Like, it was a major big deal for me at the time. And it'd taken a lot of courage to actually raise the issue, but to have it dismissed out of hand just, I think, added fuel to the fire for me.
Yeah, and it's very upsetting. But as a society, we aren't very good with fairness in so many different areas. And I'm not going to go into that because that's not really my specialty, but I just know that there are so many things that get me upset because things do seem unfair. But, we've got to have these conversations and let people talk about stuff.
It makes me want to just dive into that whole topic of fairness. What is fairness? How do people perceive it differently? What are some issues of fairness? But yeah, okay, we'll park that and I'll let that percolate in the back of my brain for the moment. There's another question I wanted to get your insight on. And you mentioned this in the book. There's a difference between trust and psychological safety. Now, psychological safety has been a big topic in the zeitgeist as well because of the work of Amy Edmondson, which is originally based on the work of Edgar Schein. And psychological safety is more popular and understood, and it kind of gets lumped in with trust. So what is the distinction between the two?
Yeah, so psychological safety, everyone in a team kind of is on the same wavelength as to whether there is or isn't psychological safety. People in teams can tell if they feel safe, and they're all pretty much, they respond the same. But if you ask individuals in a team, they're all going to come up with different answers because it's based on our individual experience and our past, things that have happened since we were kids and how we process trust and what we think trust is. So it means different things to different people. So there is a bit of a distinction. And in some ways, it's a little bit like fairness because what one person thinks is fair, someone else doesn't. So it's more personal and based on the personality of the person rather than being something that everyone's experiencing.
So that's about how people perceive feeling safe differently. What's the difference between safety and trust, the psychological safety and trust?
Oh, so safety and trust is psychological safety. Everyone feels the same way about it. They all feel safe, whereas trust, it's more based on individuals.
Oh, God. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
my brain didn't process that well.
It's a tricky one. But if you were to ask someone in a team, do you feel psychologically safe? They'll all probably say yes, 8 out of 8 people. But if you ask people, do you trust people in the team, there's quite a bit of variance. And it's that variance that I've got this assessment that I use, and I actually separate I usually do it with leadership teams, so the CEO and every other team member. And it's really interesting because you'll often find discrepancies. So usually the CEOs rate everything much higher than everyone else because they're more positive, and of course it reflects who they are, how the team's performing. So they'll rate things higher in their team than their employees. But sometimes it is the other way. And it's those discrepancies that are really interesting to talk about with the team because sometimes the CEO gets to realise where their expectations are out of alignment with everyone else. And then everyone else gets to hear where the CEO feels differently about stuff and to understand their perspective. So that's where it gets really interesting, that it can really lead to quite deeper conversations if we're willing to learn and listen.
I find that really interesting that the CEO always rates things higher than everyone else. I think part of that too is how much easier it is to be the boss in some ways because you've got authority. So you can make decisions, whereas a lot of people don't necessarily have the authority to make decisions. And it colors your perception of safety, of trust, all that kind of thing. I've got one client who was celebrating the fact that she just got granted delegation authority for her work, which means that she can make decisions based on the budget that she's been allocated instead of running every single decision past her boss, which is time consuming and deflating. You just feel like you've got a bit in your mouth all the time and you've got to wait for somebody to release the reins so you can go. And it just chips away at you. It demoralizes a little bit. So let's get some brass tacks here on the board for folks listening in. What can leaders do immediately to start fostering safety as a starting point?
Yeah, I believe that there are 3. What I do in my book is I break down 3 strategies when it comes to safety. So the first one is reducing interpersonal risk. The second one is, showing support, of course. And then the third one is actually fostering learning. So I really feel strongly that an easy one for leaders is actually learning together as a team. And it's what a lot of leaders do is they think, we just do learning when the L&D department gives us a training course. But it's not a one-off event. It's really something that you should be doing all the time. And every time you're catching up with a direct report is really an opportunity to actually help them learn what they're doing. So asking incisive questions or even just using a question such as, what did you learn from that when they've done a task or something hasn't gone the way they wanted? And just constantly doing these little breadcrumbs of learning rather than thinking it's a once-off event.
Okay, I like that. What was the first point you raised around fostering safety? Interpersonal something? I missed it.
Oh, interpersonal risk. So one of the really interesting things, and a lot of leaders don't quite get this, is that as human beings, we are really scared of other people. We just don't know it. So interpersonal risk, we're constantly scanning the environment to make sure that we're safe. The research has shown it's up to 5 times a second. It's absolutely incredible. And it makes a lot of sense because, human beings, let's face it, have been pretty terrible to one another since, millennia. And we have this fear that we don't even realise, and we're constantly worried when we're with a team that we're going to get hurt in some way. And we're not realising this subconsciously. And when I mean hurt, it's like, we're going to get kicked out of the team because we're different or we've said something wrong. We're going to lose our income. We're not going to be able to survive. Or, it could be as simple as that, people don't like us. And it really stops people from speaking up and saying something that might make them look idiotic. But the thing is, we don't realise this is constantly playing with us. And so leaders have to be really aware that people are quite frightened of one another. But it might not show up as fright. They might just not commit to something because they don't want to look stupid, but they can't articulate that.
So how do you reduce that risk? So how do you help people feel less awkward and scared of each other?
Yeah, so this is where the leader has to really ensure people know each other, learn about one another, do events where people can connect and understand their communication style, their work style, work with one another, because of course the more we're with each other, the more we get a better understanding of one another as well. And it's just ensuring that when the leader's got meetings going on, if someone says something that's not quite nice to someone or judgmental, that they do something about it so that people are interacting in a positive way.
Okay, that's great. So fostering safety is part one of your safety system. And then you've got creating connection. And it sounds like it builds a little bit on the first step.
Yeah, so they're really interrelated. But what's really interesting, and this is what I found in my research, is that people, of course, need to feel like they belong and that they're valued and that the work they're doing is meaningful. But what I found time and time again when I was doing some research, particularly in some large organisations, that, silos were being formed because people really weren't that interested in other teams or really other people in the organisation. So as a leader, there are 3 parts to this. You've got to actually connect people to the meaning of their work so that they feel that purpose. You've got to help people connect and link how their work is helping others, so the beneficiaries of their work. And that could be you as a leader, particularly if they're doing kind of drudgery sort of stuff. You've got to make it clear how that work is helping you. And then it's linking all the pieces and parts and projects and priorities in the business so that people can see that bigger picture, because often people will work on a particular part of a project and not quite understand how their work is impacting others. And that's actually really critical to high performance.
How do you think your model applies within the hybrid virtual work environment? Is there anything that needs to be adjusted here?
Yeah, well, this is where visibility becomes really important, which is one of the interactions that I've got under connection. So I love anything that shows people what's going on, because of course, when we can't see what's going on, we don't trust the situation. And it's not just leaders not trusting people to be working, but it's employees trusting one another as well. You often get a lot of complaints with other employees saying, oh, well, I can't trust Rita because I don't think she's doing the work like we are. So you want to make things visible. So whether that's project management dashboards where people can see the goals that each other is working on, or priorities are really, really important. And this is where teams often get stuck and not trusted by other teams, because you want to make sure that other teams can see your priorities and what you're working on so they can understand if you get some work from them why you're not attending to it straight away. Visibility is so important on so many different levels, and more so when we're working in a hybrid way. And the more we can do it visually, the better. And it's even when you're having a meeting with your team, ensuring that each person is responsible for talking about the work they're doing. so that other people in the team can actually see and understand what that person is doing rather than just assuming they're not working that hard.
It's a really interesting one, right? So you just don't know what people are producing. One of the things that we've introduced in our team, and it's a way of checking in with each other and to clearing the decks, really. So we have a quick virtual round robin in the morning, which is, what are your wins from yesterday? What are your priorities for today? Any blocks to progress that you need to help with? And it's a really quick insight into what people are actually focused on, because out of sight, out of mind, and it just opens up that ambiguity piece, as you say. It's like, oh, what are they actually doing with their hours? Like, you don't get to see the tangible stuff. And then they fill you in. It's like, well, I spent 4 hours on that project that you briefed me on 2 months ago. I'm like, oh, yeah. Oh, how is that thing going anyway?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really useful tip in terms of providing visibility and ensuring that people get to speak to their work. I think making it visible on a platform is useful too, because I'm against meetings that are simply, information meetings. I think that's a big time waster. So an alternative to that is having your visible dashboard. So just changing tack a little bit in terms of where people really stuff it up. Like, I think leaders always like to know, like, okay, what should I not do? What do you see are some big mistakes that leaders make when it comes to building trust in a team?
Yeah, so there are a few things, and that is that they just assume people are like them. So a lot of leaders will tell me, oh, building trust is easy. All you have to do is tell the truth and be consistent. Well, that might be what works for them, but for other people it might be different. Their direct report might not care so much about telling the truth. They might care more about getting career support. So we've really got to stop assuming what we think other people want and just ask them.
It's pretty basic, right? So, what do you need? What do you want? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
This might be basic for you, Zoe, because, you're a little bit different, but it's amazing how often I see this and hear it and often get shocked. But, with anything, there are nuances. Sometimes leaders are kind of doing it. They're just not doing it far enough.
Yeah, okay. So it sounds like a lot of asking questions and listening.
Yeah.
And I can see a lot of CEOs just rolling their eyes going,
Yeah.
When do I actually get to do some work?
Yeah, well, that's why I've written this book, because it has a system, which I call the integrated trust building system, which just makes it a little bit easier and just becomes part of what you do. But it's really getting past that thing. And this is actually much harder than we think, because it is biologically programmed. And that is just assuming stuff, but, just thinking of trust from that one-way perspective. And we all do it without realising it. We have a tendency as human beings to always think of the negative and just assume the worst in people.
Really? We assume the worst in people?
Yeah, it's like, we just assume someone's done something wrong because they're an idiot or, whatever reason. And I see this a lot. And it's really about opening up our hearts and being more understanding and compassionate to one another.
A really great example of that just flashed into my brain as you mentioned that, assuming the worst of people. And we don't think that we assume the worst of people until we discover we do. And it happened to me the other day too, was watching the Australian Open final. Not sure if you're a tennis fan. Are you a tennis fan?
Look, I did watch a little bit because there was some quite exciting matches, but don't ask me to label players. I don't know all their names.
Okay, no worries. Well, I'll set the scene for anybody who isn't familiar with tennis, because the example I think is useful. So the men's final, it's Nadal and Medvedev. Medvedev is a Russian player who's number 2 in the world, and Rafa is an incredible champion and won his 21st slam. So he's amazing. And he's been playing for 20 odd years and so on. The point about this story, though, is the image of the Russian player Medvedev. He was branded like the bad guy, if you like. He's got a temper on court. He isn't that popular because of his temper and because of his outbursts. So he had outbursts at a couple times at the umpire. He even bagged out the ball kids at one point for getting in the way. Like, it was just like, and Australians, they don't like that, right? It feels like unsportsmanship to be that arrogant, and it puts people offside. So he was branded like the not so nice guy. And that even amped him up even more. So he had this character of this guy who's not that likable, who's a bit arrogant. And then he lost, and he played brilliantly. And in the interview after, I saw a little snippet of it. And people are going to want to know about his experience of the crowd, which was clearly against him and clearly for Nadal. And that's not comfortable for anybody, right? Nobody likes to be the bad guy in any situation. It's so much easier if the crowd's cheering for you. Even if you're the underdog or not the favorite, crowd should probably support you. Like, it's just good sportsmanship in the audience to do that. But he wasn't getting much of that. Anyway, in this interview, he tells a story where he described himself as a little boy, and his first experience in the tennis is being a little kid looking up to the big players going, wow, that's amazing. And he played one of his tournaments as a junior, and people who didn't know him from a bar soap were cheering him. And he's like, wow, this sport is incredible. Like, people don't know me from a bar soap if they're encouraging me. So he's telling the story of how it lifted him and encouraged him. And he goes, now, my opinion that little boy is gone. I don't play for the crowd. I just play for me and my family and supporting my family. I'm like, oh my God. So I just felt wounded for him, because behind the arrogant player was this person who had these dreams and aspirations and didn't deserve the animosity of the crowd. Sure, he had poor behavior, but we wound and judge people. And it was very easy to picture him as this arrogant, brash, unfeeling, unsavory type. But he's a human with all these frailties beneath us. So assuming the worst of people, I can see how we do that. You know, we observe these behaviors, we don't like them, and we categorize them and go, ugh, dismiss. So we're hardwired to that. And that gets in the way of trust.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And, you know, just going back to that example you gave, I actually felt really uncomfortable watching that match because of the booing. And I stopped. And even my husband and I were talking about it. Even the one he had with, I can't remember his name. So I'm terrible with names. Yes, Kyrgios. So there was booing in that, and they, you know, people made out, no, they weren't booing, they were saying Sue or something. But it did sound a lot like booing, and I was really embarrassed Australians were doing that.
Well, it's actually a specific chant for Kyrgios, so it wasn't a boo when Kyrgios was playing. So they were actually doing woo, it's kind of like a guttural woo thing. This is just a point, but they were booing Medvedev. So he got an unsupportive crowd. So that definitely appeared. Like, I don't think you should boo anybody anytime.
And it's not fair because he's not in his home country. So he's not going to have
in a sporting
supporters.
context anyway. You know, like, actually, this could be a conversation for another time. You know, what deserves booing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Marie-Claire, this has been amazing. Where can people find out more about you and your book and the work that you do?
Yeah, good question. So it is available at all good booksellers. It's also available on my website, marieclaireross.com/trusted to thrive.
Okay, so Marie-Claire Ross, are there any hyphens in there, or is it all just one word?
It's Marie-Claire with a hyphen.
So marie-claireross.com.
Yep, /trusted-to-thrive. A bit of a mouthful.
I'm sure if you Google Trusted to Thrive, it'll come up.
It will.
Fantastic. And there'll be links in the show notes in the episode description as well. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the research that you've done around this topic. I think it's really important and valuable for all of us as leaders who are doing work with others to keep this front of mind and to really work on this. And so I appreciate the work that you've done on this and the effort it took to put out a book on the topic. So congratulations and thank you so much.
Thank you, Zoe. And I just have to say big appreciation for you for this wonderful podcast that you have and for interviewing me and delivering such great content to your listeners.
Oh, that's very kind. Thanks. What I find interesting about this interview and my key takeaway is really how we can create a system of integrated trust, and that these regular practices can create a self-reinforcing loop, and how it's the little things like listening and being curious and getting perspective or getting somebody else's perspective are the things that build safety and the things that build trust with people and building connections and so on. So that's one of my key takeaways is a system of trust. I think that's really useful. In terms of team tips, I think getting a set of questions together about, what do you perceive as fair? What's fair and equitable when it comes to appreciation, when it comes to project delegation when it comes to opportunities. And then to ask also, why do you have that belief around fairness? Like, where does that come from? And what happens if it plays out differently than you expected? I think that would be a really useful conversation to have with your team around these particular things. And it kind of starts the ball rolling in terms of conversations about understanding perception and getting people to share and to break down a little bit of the suspicions around each other. And I think the other thing too is getting to know each other is always a useful thing when it comes to building team and breaking down the suspicions, the judgments we have of others. All right. Well, as always, this episode is brought to you by Amplifiers, our high-level advanced leadership training program for CEOs, managing directors, and senior executives from all sorts of different sectors. And we break down the program into quarterly themes: leading culture, leading change, leading performance, and leading strategy. And at the moment, we are in the quarter of leading culture with a subtopic of hybrid team success. So if you've noticed, all the episodes are asking the experts that come on the show about what do you think about how this applies in a hybrid virtual environment. So if you want a cohort of people who are amazing and will challenge your thinking and you can soundboard with, as well as developing your own advanced leadership skills, then Amplifiers might be for you. Check us out at zoerouth.com, click on programs, click on Amplifiers, and reach out. Email me, zoe@zoerouth.com. We can have a chat about whether it's a fit for you. Very easy to get started. Love meeting new leaders and supporting them on the journey. Maybe that's you. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.